Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I am going to be doing a review of a book that has been on my radar for a while and I was so psyched to get an ARC of the book. Thank you so much to Angry Robot, specifically Caroline, and to Stephen himself as well for sending me a copy of this book, because today I am going to be reviewing The Judas Blossom. The Judas Blossom is absolutely fantastic. Now, this book is set during a period of a lot of turmoil and political strife and war and battle. It's very heavily influenced by the Mongols. We see a lot of real life characters in this book, and it's one of those books where it kind of does a little bit of everything and it kind of hits every single note. And there's lots of drama, there's lots of politics, there's lots of battle scenes, there's lots of machinations, and it's just a really good time. So without further ado, let's just jump into my review. So what did I like? The plot is super interesting. Now, one particular aspect of that is the Persian invasion, and I think this was just a really interesting, refreshing take on what happened when the Mongols went to Persia, and most interestingly, how the Persians actually felt about the Mongols being there. And one of the really great things about this plot is that because it's so heavily influenced by actual history, a lot of it feels very grounded. Now, there are magical elements, there are fantastical elements to this book. It could just be a history book if you remove those parts. And so it felt very real to me, and it felt kind of like I was reading a history book, even though Stephen himself has said that this is influenced by events in history and characters in history. It's not necessarily 100% historically accurate, but it does feel like that. And I really liked that about the book. The next thing that I really liked is the writing. The writing is really strong. I've not read Stephen's other books yet. I do actually own all of them. It's just a matter of time when I get to them. But I think I'm going to end up probably finishing this series first, given that he's going to be releasing each book each year. So by 2025, the series will be over. But I really like his writing style. I think it's very accessible. The difficulty with historical fiction often is that it comes across as a very dense historical book, which, don't get me wrong, I love reading a good dense history book, but I don't want to be reading that necessarily in my fiction. And yet it never felt like that. It felt very accessible, it felt very easy to read, and I ended up reading the book pretty quickly considering the time that I was reading it. I had a lot of work stuff going on. I was able to get through the book fairly quickly, a lot more quicker than I thought I would, at least. The next thing is the world building. Now, this for me is the kind of most conflicting aspect of the story. I really did like the world building. I just wanted more. This is such a rich world that we're in, and we're in different parts of the world. We're in different parts of Persia. I just would love to have felt more. One of my favorite parts of like historical fantasy fiction or historical fiction in general, and even just fantasy fiction in general, is when you have like really solid world building that makes the place feel like you are there. There were parts in the story where that happened. So there's parts kind of in the like bigger cities where, you know, Stephen talks about the smells, the taste, the architecture, and that I loved. I just would have liked more of it, to be honest. And I think that's more of a me thing than a him thing. But I'm really curious to see if and how that develops in book 2 and 3. I'm assuming it will. And I'm really excited to see that because I just loved it and I just wanted more. It reminded me a little bit of Daevabad, but I think Daevabad gets a really good balance of world building with the plot, with the characters, and I really hope we get to that level in the next couple of books. Now onto the topic that I love talking about most, and that is the characters. This is a multi-POV book. We are following 4 POVs. Multi-POV books are very hard to do because almost always you get 1 or 2 POVs that you just don't care about. This is the only time that that didn't happen. I loved every single perspective. And I loved every single perspective at different points in the book. So I never felt bored. I never felt disengaged. So as I mentioned, we follow 4 characters. We follow Hulagu Khan, Temujin, Princess Kokochin, and Kaivon. Now, Hulagu Khan is the ruler of the Ilkhanate. He's a very he's a military figure. He's a leader. Everybody looks to him for guidance. He's your typical rough and tough male lead archetype in that he has a lot of power. People listen to him. They respect him. And I just thought it was really interesting to read about a person and hear their story from their perspective essentially, and see what they see when they're doing bad things and how they kind of justify it in their own heads. I just thought that was super fascinating. The next one I really liked was Temujin. Temujin is Hulagu's son, and Temujin, if you know anything about the Mongols, was a very important person in Mongol history. And Temujin was my favorite character, probably the most out of all of them, just because he has this inner conflict of being a Mongol, but then also seeing the impact of the Mongols on other types of people. And he doesn't like it, he doesn't like violence. He's much more diplomatic. He's much more kind of zen about these things, whereas his father is the complete antithesis of that. So seeing their dynamics as well was super satisfying to read. I love a good parent-child conflict, and I think this one was captured really well. I'm really curious to see where his arc ends up in particular, because we learn some really interesting things about him towards the kind of middle and end of the book, and I just think it's going to be a wild ride. The next one is Princess Kokochin. So Kokochin is forced into marrying Hulagu as one of his many wives. She's the last of her tribe, and it's really interesting to get the female perspective, and I think Stephen writes the female perspective pretty well. She is trying to fight back against Hulagu, but in her own way, and in a way that is very different to some of the other characters in this book who kind of default to violence or default to politics. Her default is to fight back via her own inner strength, and I just really love that for her, and I'm really, really curious to see where her arc goes. And then last but not least, probably my second favorite character out of the four if I had to rank them, Kaivon. So Kaivon is a Persian rebel who was once a military leader in the Persian army. He then basically goes undercover whilst working for Hulagu Khan. Now that's not a spoiler, it's pretty much written in the back of the blurb. He basically goes to be a kind of double agent essentially. Now Kaivon is a really interesting character. I loved being in his head because again we get this conflict of trying to prove himself to Hulagu Khan and to the Mongols, whilst also still trying to remain Kaivon, the ex-Persian military leader and somebody who really cares about his people. He is a nationalist, and we see that when we get his thoughts. And so seeing his actions doing one thing, but then his beliefs saying another thing, amazing. I love it. I love kind of seeing that inner conflict that he goes through. All of these characters are pretty morally grey. They all do very questionable things. I don't think they're the darkest characters that I've ever read, but I think they have a lot of depth and complexity attached to each one of them. Each of them have their own struggles, but for different reasons. They're all trying to achieve their own goals, also for different reasons. And it is just wonderful to read, like really, really wonderful to read. The next thing I'm going to talk about is themes. There's a lot of different thematic work. I mean, there's obviously the kind of theme about like imperialism, colonialism, war, having respect for other cultures. But then there's also kind of other things that are much more kind of internally focused, like trying to find one's place, which I would say is a big thing for Temujin. The kind of role of women, which is presented with Kokochin. Then we have things like family dynamics, politics, betrayal, revenge, redemption, all of these different things at play. And I think Stephen does a really good job of balancing them all out and giving them all fair attention, whilst not detracting from the overall story or the characters. And I think that's really hard to do, and yet he managed to do it somehow in like a 400-page book. This has the potential to become a new favourite series. I loved it. Like, I really, really loved it. I gave the first book a 4.25 stars. The only reason why I didn't give it higher is twofold. One is that I think in parts of the book, it felt a little bit too slow for me, which is interesting because I tend to love slow reads. I think the pacing in places made me feel like that, because one minute we would have like a really action-packed scene and then it would just be all of a sudden like quite static. So that's, again, very much a me thing and very much a preference thing. But I'm very curious to see how the next 2-3 books shape up, because the way that the first book ends, it does end on a cliffhanger. And I think it's just going to be all guns blazing at that point. The only other reason why I didn't give it a full 5 stars is I very rarely give 5 stars to first books in series, because I want to read the entire series, and then I will often go back and change my rating after I've read all the books. So there is the potential that this might actually be higher, depending on my experience with books 2 and 3. But like I said, this has the potential to become a favourite series. I loved pretty much everything about it. I had a really good time with it. And this book actually got me out of a reading slump. I'd been in a reading slot for a few weeks. Everything I tried just was not working for me, and yet Stephen managed to get me out of it. So thanks for that, Stephen. I am hoping to do an interview with Stephen soon. We're still trying to find the right time. We actually had one scheduled, but unfortunately I got sick, and so we had to cancel. I'm really hoping that at some point we can find a time to chat. Just got to figure out a time. I've got a lot of travel and work-related stuff coming up soon, but I'm hoping that we will be able to find some time to speak, because this is a fantastic book and I'm really curious about his kind of influences and his experience writing this book. But if you do have any questions for him, definitely put them down below, and hopefully if and when we do our interview, I can ask them. But definitely go check out this book. This is quite a dark book as well. It doesn't hold back. There's quite a lot of violence. It's quite grim dark in nature, so I would definitely recommend this to a lot of you who I know love grim dark and dark fantasy. So give it a go and let me know what you think. If you've read this book, ping me down in the comments below and let me know your experience, and I will see you there. Thanks for watching, folks. Stay safe as always, take care, and I will see you soon. Bye.